So the team here at Up Front at ENCA decided that this Women's Day we'd speak to some of South Africa's game changers who happen to be women. One of them is Ncebakazi Manzi, who is a regional radio station Kaya FM's executive content producer and is host of the In Therapy podcast. It's really been making waves. It focuses on the importance of mental health, specifically amongst the black community. And she joins us in the studio. Ncebakazi, thank you so much. The radio producers are of the hardest working people in the business. So you coming in on the public holiday, we really, really do appreciate it. Now, I know this journey for you started a long time ago. But you point to 2010 when you realized that you needed to start looking for a therapist. But you didn't know anyone who was seeing a therapist. How did you go about it, and why was it so important for you to find somebody to talk to?
Yeah. So I had to rely on television programs and books that mentioned a psychologist. I had figured out quite early on in my teenage years that there was something amiss in my personality and in my character as a result of certain personal struggles that I'd had, traumatic events that I'd gone through. And by 2010, suppressing those feelings was really not helping me. And the cracks were starting to show, and I realized that I needed to find someone to talk to.
Now, we come from communities where I think we were probably of that last generation where in our communities it's just not the done thing to go and talk to a stranger about your personal things. It's just not the done thing, you know. If I'm allowed to say so, you'd have the saying, that's what white people do, you know. No offense intended. But you then took that step and you found a therapist to speak to, and it's had a life-changing impact on your life, hasn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I was in therapy for 8 years. Which is a fairly long time, but it depends on the model of therapy that your therapist uses and what you agree on between yourself and the therapist. And the benefits are insane, just in terms of having self-awareness and understanding of who you are, because some of those traumatic experiences alter your personality so much that you don't have a good sense of who you are. And so for me, it was about reclaiming my life and understanding who could I have possibly been without those traumatic incidents? And as I say, fetching my life, as people say.
Fetching your life, I like that saying. Do you find now, since 2010, it's only 9 years, which is not a long time, do you find that, especially amongst our communities, that people are more open to the need for therapy and not necessarily if you think there is something wrong?
Yeah. So when I started, I was deeply ashamed of the fact that I was in therapy and told very few people. Now, anyone with an ear, I'll tell them I'm in therapy at parties and wherever.
But you see it on social media as well. People
Absolutely,
are speaking openly about it.
Exactly.
That can only be a healthy thing, surely, if it's done in the right way.
Absolutely. There are even a lot of the people that I found for the podcast, I found through social media. And I was taken aback by the extent to which people were just open about this experience. And that to me told me, as you are suggesting, that there is a shift in our communities with people wanting to be open about these sort of experiences. And for me, it was important for each person to take me through the benefits for themselves, what they have seen, the experience. Race was an important thing for a lot of people. A few of the people that I spoke to were like, I cannot speak to a white person about my experiences because they're not going to understand. Age was a concern for some people, even gender, you know. So for me, it also answered a lot of people's questions who, when I started opening up about being in therapy, had questions about how does this thing work? What do you actually talk about when you are with a therapist? And so it's really given people an opportunity to have a better understanding of that.
Tell us about this podcast, In Therapy. You went through a very personal experience and you realized more and more people are doing it, women your age and of various ages and creeds. Why did you think there was a need to turn this into something that people that you don't even know can listen into?
For me, it was, first of all, the curiosity that people had. And also, I had the fortunate opportunity of seeing a therapist at really reduced prices. The access to therapy is a major concern in this country. People quote somewhere between 900 and 1.5 per session. And my therapist was generous enough to say, actually, you can see me at 200 Rand per session.
Wow.
And so for me, and that was why it was possible for me to be in therapy for so long, because I could afford, 800 Rand per month versus 800 Rand per session. every single week. You know, there's a huge difference.
Is it fair to say that therapy in this country is a privilege?
Absolutely. It's a privilege for middle-class people, and it should not be that way. There are wonderful organizations who are providing therapy at reduced prices, but there just aren't enough of them. And so there is a crisis in this country in terms of access to therapy. And so for me, having somebody like that who was able to be that generous said to me that I had a responsibility to do something. And so for me, it was a way of giving back and saying thank you to her for the immense impact that it's had on my life. And as a result, a lot of people who listen to the podcast come back and say to me, I'm actually making that call to go see a therapist as a result of having listened. You know, a lot of people are thinking about it, so it's not as though my podcast has, it just makes people think, okay, actually, let me make that call and call a therapist.
You know, there's something we both know, that the radio medium is an especially intimate one, which is, it's why it will never go away and it will continue to stay with you. But I find, because I just recently started listening to podcasts, I find that podcasts are even more intimate because you can choose who and what you want to listen to. How difficult has it been for you to get people to come on your podcast and to speak about a very private matter like therapy?
I've been very fortunate in that the people who agreed to come onto the podcast understood the intention and the objective of it. And because they, in their own personal lives, are also confronted with people who are curious about it, saw this as an opportunity. I had one woman who actually spoke about her sexual abuse for the first time on the podcast. Wow. Because one of the things that I make sure I do is to create an environment that is safe. So it's usually just myself and the other person. There's nobody else in the room.
No engineer, no technical people.
Exactly. Just myself and that person, you know. And I try as much as possible to be sincere about what this is. Of course, as a producer, you want a project to have entertainment value, but it's not sleazy. It's about just you opening up about your experience.
And it's not voyeuristic either.
Exactly.
It's almost a privilege to be able to listen to this person share of themselves in such a raw and honest way. I listened to your more recent one, and that one, for me, I found quite raw, but also empowering. At the same time, I think it was the one end of July, an artist that you spoke to. I forget her name. Lindo Kuhle. Yes, indeed. And I found her so vivacious and yet so vulnerable at the same time. What have you found is a golden thread? I suppose in South Africa we speak about crime a lot. There are people that suffer trauma as a result of crime all the time. Is there a lot of that that's fueling people to go to therapy and to find help?
What was more prevalent in the podcast was sexual abuse and sexual violence. So it was never a focus of the conversations, but it came up. I allow people to just talk about their experiences, and at least 4 people out of the 10 episodes that I've done spoke about sexual abuse and sexual violence. So that tells you how deep the problem in our society is. And it tells you that there are people who experience this, and as a result of that are impacted negatively. Their mental health is impacted negatively as a result. And so for me, as much as therapy is important, we also need to talk about the structural issues that make certain conditions possible, you know, that make the idea of people suffering in this way possible. It's not enough to go to therapy. It must not happen in the first place, you know. And so at the same time, I have to think about the limitations of therapy. Joblessness and landlessness in this country is a major issue. And so you can imagine how many people are frustrated as a result of that. Starvation and hunger, you know, and being in therapy is not... can only go so far. Exactly.
Those are specific events that have happened in people's lives where they go out and seek help. But I was quite taken by one quote from Lindo Kuhle in your last podcast, or one of your last podcasts. She said, you go to therapy, there's this thing where you go to therapy because you're not well. But that doesn't mean that every time you go to therapy, you need to continually speak about things that are not well, because that in the end has a negative impact. In the end, therapy is supposed to set you free and see and have you move towards the light, for want of an overused phrase.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to be able to see those positive things that happen, because you can be so clouded as a result of the trauma that you don't see reason to celebrate good things, you know. And so once you have a good relationship with the therapist, you're able to say, actually, today was really, really awesome. And that's content. That's something that you are able to talk about with your therapist about. Why was this so good? How different is it to previous experiences, you know?
Well, I think the conversations you are making us have is really, really awesome as well. Thank you so much for coming in and for the work that you're doing. Ncebakazi Manzi is Kaya FM's executive content producer, and more importantly, she's the host of the In Therapy podcast that you can get on kayafm.co.za. You just have to click on podcast, and it's just one of the podcasts that you can click on there and listen to. Thank you so much for coming in.